All right, ladies and gentlemen, if we can take our seats, we can get people in from the hallway. Okay, folks, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. With a PhD in American history from the University of Florida and a stint teaching world history and world environmental history at Monmouth University, our next speaker, Mr. Simone, does not lack for academic cred, by far. But to me, it was his stint as a curator for the NASCAR Hall of Fame from 2016 to 2021, that drew the most interest from myself. Dan is another repeat speaker here. We've always enjoyed having him here. Don't worry, he's still gainfully employed, even though he doesn't work for the NASCAR Hall of Fame anymore. In fact, he sits on the board for the Hall of Fame induction for the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Dan last year talked about, for those of us on the East Coast, a somewhat overlooked series, NASCAR's Winston West Series. And I believe Dan's going to speak about that today. So you're going to learn more about the people, the personalities, and all the cool people that raced on the West Coast. And without further ado, let me introduce Dan Simone.
Thank you. Thanks, Skip. It's great to be back again this year. Just a shout out to Allison's the previous presentation. Lynn Paxton was outstanding. He was just one of those true pioneers of maintaining and keeping and promoting racing history. And one of my favorite oral histories that I ever conducted was with Lynn about 20 years ago. And it once again shows, even though the oral histories have their weaknesses in some respects, and they have to be carefully, and information needs to be carefully extracted from those oral histories. Just capturing voices on tape is just, that in itself is so important. So, he was really an incredible racer and an incredible historian. So, pretty tough to follow that. But thanks again for having me. I spoke about West Coast racing last year, and particularly about Ray Elder and the racing farmers, and some of that ties into my topic for this year, as I look mostly at the Winston West Series and its history in the second half of the 1970s. Competitors, spectators, fans in the motorsports industry, from the highest levels to the grassroots, hoped normalcy would return to American motorsports at the start of the 1975 season. A year earlier, many feared automobile racing could be banned, as was the case after the American entry into World War II. In 1974, the OPEC Oil Embargo had a profound influence on sport, travel, and recreation throughout the United States. And nearly all varieties of auto racing, American auto racing, got through the first half of the season with abbreviated competition weekends, shortened races, canceled events, and temporary, or in some instances, permanent track closures. To be sure, the 1974 auto racing season was like no other season before or since. The oil embargo did force some to reconsider motorsports and its place in the environment. A growing citizen-based environmental consciousness, suburban sprawl, highway construction, noise pollution, and other factors put motorsports more on the defensive. And nationwide, many track owners and operators were permanently placed under a great amount of strain. The signs were rather obvious, and many did not quite know their days were numbered. But from 1975 to 1979, national racing entities, as well as smaller regional series and divisions, pressed on despite a rough decade for the American economy. One regional series competing under a national banner was the NASCAR Winston West Series. From 1975 through 1979, the division featured robust schedules with annual visits to many of the same facilities, a deep talent pool, and memorable races. It's going back to its early days. In 1954, 5 years after what is now known as the NASCAR Cup Series was inaugurated, the NASCAR Pacific Coast Late Model Division began competition. Teams and drivers in regionally and locally sponsored stock cars competed mostly in California, with occasional events in other Western states and British Columbia, Canada. During the 1950s, Pacific Coast Division drivers did occasionally venture east to race in NASCAR Cup, or as it was known then, Grand National events. And beginning in 1959, it was not uncommon for West Coasters to trek all the way east to Florida to take a stab at qualifying for the Daytona 500. However, West Coast racers did not have to journey across America if they wanted to pit their talents behind the wheel and in the garage against the Cup Series, hoping to spoil the efforts of Cup regulars. Riverside International Raceway, which first hosted races in 1957, became Southern California's capital of American autosport in the 1960s. Riverside was located about an hour's drive east of Los Angeles in the then sparsely populated wine-growing desert community of Moreno Valley. The track accommodated all forms of motorsports and attracted domestic and foreign competition, even hosting a Formula One race in 1960. And during the 1960s, NASCAR's top division visited Riverside twice a year. There were a couple occasions where it raced, the Cup Series raced there 3 times in the season. The NASCAR Pacific Coast late model division changed names a bunch of times. It became the NASCAR Grand National West Division for the 1970 season. R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company entered the sport in 1971 through its Winston brand, brought money and support to the Cup Series, but also to other divisions. For a time, it was known as the NASCAR Winston Western Grand National Series, and eventually in the mid-70s was referred to by its most famous moniker, the NASCAR Winston West Series. Perhaps no better place to start a discussion of the 1975 Winston West season is with a brief mention of who was not on the track. Jack McCoy concluded his driving career at the close of the 1974 Winston West season. The Modesto, California driver claimed 2 championships, one in 1966 and another in 1973, and is best remembered for being credited with 54 series victories. His indelible impact on the growth and development of the series cannot be quantified. Not to be overlooked, there was a second major series absence in 1975. Dick Bound quit his career behind the wheel after competing in the season opener at Riverside in January. He won 14 races in the division and was one of the most popular drivers to hail from the Pacific Northwest in the first decades of the series. McCoy and Bound left behind a talented group of series regulars and young drivers. A few had aspirations of moving on to the Winston Cup Series, but most maintained a focused commitment to excellence at the regional level, ensuring the series would remain vibrant for the second half of the decade. Ray Elder, one driver who hoped to race full-time at the national level, picked up championship number 5 in 1974, and few were willing to bet against the pride of tiny Carruthers, California, in his quest for a 6th title in 1975. Elder was still in his early 30s, and the racing farmers, his laser-focused and loyal team of family and friends, were up to the challenge. After McCoy and Bound hung up their helmets, Elder remained as the only longtime veteran of the series to compete on a full-time basis in 1975, as he sought a full-time ride in the Winston Cup Series. Elder was no stranger to victory lane in NASCAR's elite division. He defeated all of the Cup drivers, winning at Riverside in 1971, and then winning again in the second Riverside race in 1972. And in 1975, Elder made it a half a dozen Winston West championships. Elder's final title would be one of his finest. He won 5 races, including his 9th and final triumph on the dirt at the legendary Ascot Park just outside of Los Angeles. Elder posted 14 top 5s, finished on the lead lap 12 times, and was one of 4 drivers who competed in all 18 points-paying contests. Elder moved to the top of the points after a 5th-place finish at Phoenix, Arizona's Manzanita Speedway in the 3rd race of the season on May 10. Later that year, the West Series returned to Manzanita for a second date. It was the final time the division competed at the legendary Phoenix facility, perhaps most famous for its rich history of wingless sprint car racing. Although the Arizona State Fairgrounds in Phoenix, which was paved in the early 1960s, would absolutely require inclusion in the debate, There is no more iconic dirt track in the Valley of the Sun and in the Grand Canyon state than Manzanita. And according to one of the greatest contributors of our understanding and deep knowledge of track histories in both the US and Canada, was the late Alan Brown, who should be in every racing hall of fame in the United States by next year. Manzanita, which originally hosted dog races, began hosting auto races in 1951. But the development of affordable air conditioning, the interstate highway system, and a growing baby boomer population led to massive growth in many small Sunbelt cities beginning in the 1950s. Greater Phoenix has become one of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States. The Manzanita property sold for development in 2009. Many of the tracks once on the Winston West calendar throughout the 70s suffered similar fates in the decades to come and are long gone today. And returning from this racetrack rabbit hole, Elder won his 45th career race at Manzanita, and it was his final trump of the 1975 season. For Elder, the path towards championship number 6 was a little easier than some of the others, primarily because 3 of the biggest names in Western racing at the time, Herschel McGriff, Chuck Bown, and Jimmy Insolo, raced in scattered events that season, none competing the full season. Herschel McGriff, an age-defying lumberman from Portland, Oregon, began racing in 1945. In 1950, he teamed up with co-driver Ray Elliott to win the inaugural Mexican road race in a 1950 Oldsmobile. I believe that car was on display when he was inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame a couple of years ago. Later that summer in 1950, McGriff journeyed diagonally across the country to South Carolina to finish 9th at Darlington Raceway in the first Southern 500. He then went on to win 4 Cup races in 1954 before stepping away from the sport until the mid-60s to raise his family and to develop his businesses. Looking back now, we can see that McGriff, already approaching 50 in 1975, was more or less still getting warmed up at an age where most drivers were considering retirement. At this stage of his career, he set his sights on competing at Le Mans, and in 1976, McGriff and his son traveled to France and competed in the 24 hours. Throughout the 1970s, he often raced at Portland Speedway, his home track, where he won 5 straight Winston West races in between 1971 and 1973. Beginning in 1980, he committed to full-time Winston West seasons, and McGriff was voted Winston West's most popular driver for 12 consecutive seasons. He won the series championship in 1986 and claimed 34 West Series victories, his last one coming in 1989 at the age of 61. McGriff strapped himself into a West Series event in 2018 in Tucson, Arizona at the age of 90. And he was inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame a couple of years ago. McGriff is also the all-time winningest racer at Riverside. As Shav Glick, a member of multiple Halls of Fame who covered motorsports for decades for the Los Angeles Times, reflected shortly after Riverside's 1988 closure, on a cool Saturday in January of 1969, the Permatex 100 unveiled a driver who went on to win more road races than anyone else would ever win there. Herschel McGriff, almost totally unknown in Southern California, started 41st, in last, but by the 6th lap, he was in 2nd, and he wound up passing Ron Grable to win. Who is this guy? The assembled media and the track officials asked. Well, McGriff scored his 14th and last Riverside victory in the 1985 Pep Boys 300 at the age of 57. He was 60 when he drove in the 1988 Budweiser 400, the final NASCAR Winston Cup race held at Riverside, where he also served as the event's Grand Marshal. McGriff did not race full-time in the series from 1973 through 79. In 75, he competed in 4 Winston West Series events, but 3 were joint cup races, 2 at Riverside and 1 at Ontario. He competed at Evergreen Raceway in Washington in his only pure Winston West contest, where he finished 2nd behind Elder. So that following January 16th at the Winston West Awards banquet in early 1976, Ray Elder received a $10,000 bonus for claiming the championship at the Winston West Series banquet held at Riverside. Runner-up Sonny Easley received $6,500 for his efforts, finishing second in 1975, his last full-time season on the circuit. He also finished second in 1973. Easley, who began racing in 1963, mounted a respectable career on the West Coast, including 8 victories in the circuit, before losing his life in a freak accident while practicing at Riverside in 1978. Douglas Gruntz, one of his crew members, also perished in the accident. Chuck Wall finished 3rd overall and picked up $5,000 for his efforts. The Burbank driver only won his only career events that year. But it truly was a night to remember for the racing farmers. Race crew chief and brother Richard Elder won the Golden Wrench Award, and NASCAR representative Ken Piper honored Fred and Laura Elder with a special appreciation award for their efforts to promote racing on the West Coast. For over a decade, Fred served as car owner, and family matriarch Laura took care of the rest of the family and young grandchildren. It was a sweet award ceremony, but the window was closing for Elder as the 76 season approached. After failing to do so in 1975, Elder hoped he would finally score an opportunity to race full-time with the Winston Cup Series at the start of the 1976 season. With 2 children to support and a family farm to maintain, a temporary relocation to where the big Winston Cup teams were based, anywhere throughout the Southeast, it needed to happen soon. But an opportunity with the sport's premier division did not materialize. Worse, Olympia Brewing opted to discontinue their sponsorship commitment, and the racing farmers were back on their own. The Washington-based brewery shifted their marketing objectives and began focusing on their own series across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Consequently, with no corporate cash, Elder decided not to compete for a 7th Winston West Championship in 1976, as he warned his fans the previous year. Unable to land sponsorship and committed to the family farm and family matters, Ray Elder pulled out of the sport for nearly all of 1976, and the racing farmers ceased operations. Richard Petty would race for his 7th Cup Championship in 1976. Ray Elder would not race for his 7th West title. That 76 season opened, as it often did, at Riverside with a combined Cup and West race, and as always, a group of regional regulars took a stab at making the race. Every January and June during the 1970s, Winston Cup drivers had to muscle their cars up and down and around an unfamiliar road course, their crews tasked with setting up a car to turn right. Back then, it was the only road course on the schedule. Watkins Glen would not become a series staple until 1986. The Winston Cup stars had to compete against a group of talented drivers and crews with a home track advantage. And not surprisingly, the South versus West dynamic was fodder for the California sports writers who ramped up the pre-race hype in the days leading up to the event. Benny Parsons, who finished 3rd at the previous Riverside race in June 1975, mentioned both Elder and Jimmy Insolo as 2 of the guys to beat in a pre-race interview. Parsons, the 73 Cup champion, knew he had to finish ahead of the local ringers if he hoped to produce a good result to start the 1976 Winston Cup season. Well, driving for Wood Brothers Racing, David Pearson earned his first win at Riverside after 13 tries. That same Sunday, the Pittsburgh Steelers defeated the Dallas Cowboys in Super Bowl X by a score of 21-17. Cale Yarborough finished 2nd in front of nearly 55,000 race fans. This race would also mark the last time 2 Winston West regulars would finish in the top 5 at Riverside. Jimmy Insolo, starting way back in row 13, drove all the way to a lead lap podium finish, taking 3rd. Insolo bested Elder, who entered the Riverside race, hoping to again spoil as he did in 71 and 72. Elder came from row 5 and battled to a 4th place result, the first driver 1 lap down. Elder put himself in position for Cup Series win number 3, at one time racing side by side with eventual winner Pearson at one point in the race. Eventually, Elder ran out of room and slid off the track, eventually going on to muscle to a 4th place result, a lap down. Benny Parsons, by the way, rounded out the top 5. Winston West regulars once again took it to nearly all of the Cup regulars. But that was just about it, because good runs for Winston West drivers waned considerably over the next 10 years at both Riverside and at Ontario. The way the 1976 season was set up, a lengthy scheduling gap gave West Coasters plenty of time to prepare for their true season opener. And as spring approached, both racers and fans realized there would be a first-time champion in 1976. Chuck Bown, only 22 years old, but already a Winston West veteran, had the talent, resources, connections, and personality to make a mark on a national series someday. He was Herschel McGriff's son-in-law, grew up around and raced against his dad, Dick Bown, in many events, competing in his first series race at the age of 16 in 1970. After two strong Winston West full seasons in 72 and 73, Chuck Bown raced a limited number of events in 74 and 75. However, he consistently ran up front with the leaders, posting 35 career top finishes out of 75 races. Dick Bown's Rose Auto Wrecking sponsored his son Chuck's cars through the 1975 season. However, in 1976, Bown would compete in the series driving a 1975 Chevy Laguna, prepared by fellow Northwesterner and engine specialist Jack D. McCoy, not to be confused with the champion driver from Modesto, with Gerald Craker serving as car owner with Lakes Drywall, a local company operating out of Oregon, as primary sponsor. With additional sponsorship and assistance extending beyond the family business, Bown was positioned to become the first driver other than Elder or McCoy to win the championship, since Scotty Kane did, winning back-to-back titles in 1967 and 68. On June 27th, Chuck Bown began his championship run in the Winston West regular season opener at the paved 5/8 mile oval at Evergreen Speedway. It was Bown's only series win that year. The 1976 season consisted of 13 races, 3 of which were combined Cup events, 2 at Riverside in January and in June, and 1 in Ontario in November. Just like the Winston Cup Series, commitment, consistency, competing laps were again the keys to a championship run on the Western Circuit, as it had been so many times before. Bown was the only driver to compete in every race, having the funding, team support, and time to do so. The 22-year-old driver never finished outside the top 5 the entire season. He competed every lap but one when he finished second in the series return to Evergreen that summer. His incredible consistency made for a runaway points battle, something NASCAR and most racing sanctioning bodies have struggled with since the first champions were awarded over a century ago. Some, of course, implementing a playoff system or double points paying races in an attempt to remedy this long-standing issue. But what a difference a few years makes. The drivers who won so many of the races in the first half of the 1970s were now gone. They were out of the sport, or they weren't racing in the West Series full time. Enter a 41-year-old brand new champion in 1977, Bill Schmidt. He established himself as a consistent Tough Series competitor in his 74 debut season and picked up his first series victory the following year, coming in the Coca-Cola 150 at Portland Raceway. In 1976, he returned to victory lane, taking the checkers at the 1/3 mile oval at Anderson Speedway in Shasta, California, which he also owned and operated. In 1977, Schmidt picked up 3 wins and 13 top 5s in his number 73 Chevy, which featured Old Milwaukee sponsorship in some of the races. That year, Schmidt competed in all the races for the first time. Only 2 drivers, Schmidt and Bown, competed in all 20 scheduled races, including the 2 joint Cup events. Schmidt won the championship with a 111-point margin. One of the best drivers to emerge from Northern California, Schmidt remained competitive into his 50s and wound up with 4 series championships. His 19th and final Winston West Series win came in 1992 at the age of 56. Perhaps only Herschel McGriff raced against more future NASCAR Cup Series regulars on the West Coast as often as Schmidt. Both often battled it out on West Coast bull rings with young drivers who would find their way to full-time rides in the Cup Series many years later. Chad Little, Derek Cope, and four-time Truck Series champion Ron Hornaday Jr. were some of the drivers that they battled against as they were starting their careers. Interesting combination of generations racing during that time, because Schmidt also raced against Ernie Irvan, who raced in his first full-time Cup season in 1988 and helped put West Coast stock car racers on the national stage for good. Regionalism persisted in American stock car racing headed into the 1980s. Southeastern drivers still dominated, but Irvan was one of the drivers who began to change that permanently. The second generation versatile driver from Salinas, California won the 1991 Daytona 500 and wrapped up his injury-shortened career with 15 wins in NASCAR's top division on all types of tracks. Also somewhat overlooked by racing communities east of the Pacific Coast, both racers and historians, Ernie's father, Vic, for over 2 decades, was one of the top local pilots on the West Coast. Vic Irvin picked up his lone career Winston West win at one of its most iconic and toughest tracks, taking the checkers at Ascot on May 30th. Ron Hornaday is another driver I should have mentioned too, who also saw success racing the series in the 1960s. Moving into 1978, 2 big early storylines unfolded before they even took to the racetrack. Chuck Bown was gone and Ray Elder was back. Bown relocated to Charlotte with aspirations to land a full-time Winston Cup ride. But opportunities did not come to fruition as he continued his racing career east of the Mississippi. In 1979, he finished 7th in the Daytona 500, and later that July was credited with a 6th place in the Firecracker 400 at the same track. Bown raced in roughly 50 Cup events in the 70s and 80s, and his persistence and talent would pay off. He would race 4 seasons in the NASCAR North Series and 2 more stints with the NASCAR Busch North Series in 87 and 88, and battle it out with Northeastern regional aces such as Dave Dion and Robbie Crouch. There was a lot of tough competition during this time, as some New Englanders competing in the division verged on moving on to competing in the Winston Cup Series. But though it was a long journey for Bown, it was certainly one mission accomplished for the West Coast, more specifically the Northwest, when he captured the 1990 NASCAR Busch Series championship, with 6 wins that year to boot. Elder, however, was set to run a full season in '78, the first and only of his career without the Racing Farmers. He was also driving a red and yellow number 32, not the iconic 96 and familiar blue. The team was a serious championship contender with strong ownership with Dave Hill and sponsorship from Midland Homes and some former Racing Farmer team members providing support. At Las Vegas later that summer, Elder won his final West Series race and won 2 races that year. And despite many good runs, he wrapped up the season in 4th place overall. Not only did he add to his impressive resume, he also showed that he could win without the full Racing Farmers operation. Overall, 6 championships, 47 series wins, countless heat victories, and 2 Cup wins. He was so good on all different types of tracks, but he really, probably more than anywhere else, mastered the dirt surface at Ascot Park. The best racers adapt to nuances and compositions of different dirt surfaces. They understand racing environments, and the best crews also recognize how environmental factors dictate the speed and performance of a racing machine. Ascot was unique, as Glick reflected in 1990, the year of its closure. Several things set Ascot apart from other tracks. For one, it is 60 yards short of a half mile, So it's exceptionally fast, and being close to the ocean, the sea air rolls in during the evening and helps keep the track from drying out and becoming too slippery. At Ascot, Elder perhaps best understood these factors more than any driver of his generation. No NASCAR Hall of Fame yet for Ray Elder, but it's hard to imagine the well-informed selection committee ignoring his accomplishments much longer. In 1978, Elder was the only driver other than Jimmy Inslow to win more than once that year. Inslow had the best Winston West Series season of his career that year. Originally from Mission Hills, California, Inslow began racing at roughly the same time as Elder in the early 1960s. However, Inslow hit his stride a little bit later in his career. He made his Winston West debut in 1970, claiming his first victory the following year, coming at the quarter-miler at Craig Road Speedway on the outskirts of Las Vegas. In 1972, he finished third in points, winning 7 races along the way, including 4 in a row in a span of 6 days. Gentleman Jim, as he was known for his clean driving style, was popular and respected among fans and competitors on the West Coast. Inslow drove the number 38 for most of his career. It was nearly as iconic as Elder's 96 on the West Coast. But his best Winston West seasons, however, came driving the number 1 car for Jerry Craker, who was one of the top owners of the decade. He was the same car owner that Chuck Bound had great success with before he relocated to the East Coast. In '78, Inslow won 9 of 22 races. The 1973 West season finale took place on Thanksgiving weekend, and Inslow again proved he could hang with and beat some of the best funded and seasoned Winston Cup drivers after finishing behind the King, who traveled out to Arizona to race in the event, hoping to spoil the show, which he did. He claimed the pole position and won the Arizona Napa 250. Inslow was second, and then there were a couple more Cup drivers who came out west with their season having been completed. Bobby Allison finished second. Neil Bonnet took third. The race was held the week following the conclusion of the '78 Cup season and proved to be a much-needed confidence boost to wrap up Richard Petty's season. Petty Enterprises struggled to get the Dodge Magnum up to speed during most of the year, and the King went winless in 1978 for the first time ever and also finished 6th in points. It was the worst he had finished in the standings, not including his abbreviated season in 1965, since placing 8th in the points in 1962. It's a little foreshadowing here as we move into the final year of my study, of my presentation. 1979. We can get into everything that took place in February at the Daytona 500, the Great American Race. We can never assume that everybody in the audience knows some of the facts, some of the commonly known racing facts that we talk about. But it goes without saying that most of us know that the '79 Daytona 500, the fight between Donnie, Bobby, and Cale was a pretty big deal. And it snowed that weekend, and people were stuck inside, and they had nothing else to watch on television. Football season had ended, and it was. And you cannot argue against how much of a benchmark event that was for stock car racing, particularly for NASCAR. But it was also one of the most important seasons for NASCAR as well. But NASCAR aside for a moment, 1979 was tough for many Americans, marked by a struggling economy and yet another gas crisis. '79 was also a benchmark year for racing, and many people in this room over the years discussed some of the developments from 1979 in previous presentations over the years. The CART-USAC split being perhaps the most memorable and significant in that it permanently altered the trajectory of American open wheel championship racing. But there were a lot of different things that took place in '79 that really directed racing's direction headed into a new decade. But what about the Winston West Series? A few up-and-comers began making noise in the series. The season featured more drivers than usual competing in the entire schedule, and an exciting points battle unfolded. The most promising newcomer was Tim Williamson. From Seaside, California, which is not too far from Monterey, Williamson began competing in go-karts as a high schooler before making the jump to race cars in 1974. He spent a few seasons developing his skills at Merced in Watsonville, and in 1978 he won his first Winston West race in his very first attempt, leading 99 of 100 laps in a 1976 Chevy at Stockton 99 Speedway in the fifth event on the series calendar. He competed in 5 races in 1978 and also took pole position at the Sears Point Road Course, winding up 6th. He was only 22 at the time. Williamson got off to a hot start at the outset of the 1979 racing season. In January, he won the 300-kilometer NASCAR Grand American race at Riverside, ahead of Bobby Allison and Herschel McGriff. He finished 9th at the season-opening NASCAR Cup Series event at Riverside in his Oldsmobile, and then he won again in June when the Grand American division returned to Riverside. The end of the decade also saw the emergence of one of the greatest Canadian stock car racers of all time. Racing Roy, the stock car boy Smith, won his first career race in 1979. He began competing in the series in the 70s and became a full-time racer in the 80s, claiming back-to-back-to-back championships from 1980 through 82, the first driver to three-peat since Elder did it. Smith won another in 1988. He finished 10th in the standings in 1979, having competed in just over half of the series schedule that year. Sharon Bishop became the first woman to run full-time in the series. The Washington-based driver was somewhat of the Janet Guthrie of the West Series, who raced from 1975 through 1980 in NASCAR competition, paving the way for regional racers such as Bishop. With her husband serving as crew chief, Bishop raced in 3 seasons, never competing a full schedule, but regularly mixing it up with the best drivers in the series and putting together some good runs along the way. In 1979, Bishop wound up 9th overall in the Winston West standings. The 79 season was tight all the way to the finish, much closer than the previous season. 5 drivers competed in all 16 events, and that same quintet finished in the top 5, but only separated by 105 points. Williamson maintained the points lead throughout most of the fall, and a season worth of racing came down to the final event. Schmidt and Williamson led the championship battle into the season finale in the Napa, Arizona 250 at Phoenix, though Jimmy Inslow and Richard White were also still mathematically in the mix. Schmidt finished 11th, 5 laps down, while Williamson took 4th, 1 lap down. Schmidt earned that finish after crashing in an oil spill on the track left behind after Jimmy Inslow blew his engine on the 2nd lap. Schmidt crashed hard into the wall and returned to the race. He nursed his car around the 1-mile flat oval, and every lap he completed and every car he passed was critical. At the end of the 156-lap race, only 5 points separated Schmidt, the championship veteran, and Williamson, the emerging superstar. Williamson had an average finish of 7.8. Schmidt's was 9.1. Williamson had 1 victory. Schmidt had 4. Schmidt had 9 top 5s. Williamson had 8. But Schmidt had 10 top 10s to Williamson's 13. Yeah, I have this program at home. I just love this cover. It's the earliest memories for me, not just with movies, but also watching races and the Darth Vader, and then Darrell Waltrip, and I guess that's Stevie. Yeah, it's a great cover, and it's pretty hard to see who the villain was in '79. It wasn't Richard Petty. It definitely was Waltrip, and Waltrip was getting better and better and making a lot of noise, and it was just a matter of time before he was going to win a Cup championship, and there was a real good chance it was going to come in '79. Because at the time, it was the closest championship chase in history. It was a season-long, neck-to-neck battle between Petty and Darrell Waltrip, and the championship would be decided at the final race at the Indianapolis of the West, the 2.5-mile oval at Ontario. Petty finished 5th on the lead lap, while DW came home 8th, 1 lap down. Both received 5 crucial bonus points for leading a lap. I missed that old NASCAR points system. It was 5, top for finishing 1 through 10. I think you received 5, increments of 5 points, and it was down to 4 points, then down to 3 points. I think that ended right about when Winston got out of the sport and Nextel came in and the playoff system was put in. But I still miss that. It rewarded consistency, that old system. By the numbers, Petty won 5 races. Waltrip claimed 7 victories. The King's average finish was 6.4. Waltrip's was 7.0. Petty had 23 top 5s. DW had 19. Petty had 27 top 10s. Waltrip had 22. Petty won a single pole. Waltrip was credited with 5. But it's the littlest of little things, and really where part of the title of my presentation comes from. Yes, in many instances, luck factors into a season, just as hard work, hard driving, brilliant strategy, and precise pit work factors into championships, just as often down to individual races. Then there are those moments that are little known at the time to have massive implications down the road. A lot of you, or some of you, have probably heard this story before, but it shows how sometimes statistics and numbers are only part of the equation, whereas impact is sometimes unquantifiable. Re-enter Jimmy Insolo. By the time the NASCAR Cup Series returned to Riverside for its second date in June 1979, Insolo had clearly made his mark with the Cup Series drivers. He had already posted 8 top 10s, 4 of which were top 5s in Cup events from 73 through 78. Seeing success at Riverside and Ontario too. So he was good on the road course, and he was able to run fast at Ontario. He was also on his way to another excellent Winston West season. Although he didn't repeat as champion, he was locked up in the points battle all season long, ultimately placing 3rd in the championship. He won 2 races, one at Sears Point, another one at Spokane, Washington, and Insolo started the June Riverside event on the front row after qualifying 2nd. He set the track record in 1978 in the 1977 Camaro for a Grand American stock car race with a lap of 117.585. So it was no surprise he would qualify outside the front row, by the way, next to rookie Dale Earnhardt for the 1979 Summer Cup race at Riverside. In fact, the 79 Cup season featured the emergence of Earnhardt, who won his first race that year and took Rookie of the Year honors. In the final race of 1978, Insolo started the Ontario race for Earnhardt. This allowed the young contender to hold on to his rookie status for the 1979 season. As per NASCAR rules, Insolo earned the 7th-place finish Earnhardt came home with. Insolo was running in the top 5 at Riverside until blowing his engine on lap 45. His day came to an early end. He cooled off and changed into his street clothes. The race took place on a hotter than normal day, and the drivers still competing in the race had to contest a difficult racetrack under exceptionally uncomfortable weather conditions. Meanwhile, Richard Petty, who is as tough as they come, was struggling behind the wheel of his famous 43. To make matters worse for Petty, he was already not feeling well on race day, and he was wrestling with mechanical issues with his Dodge. Crew Chief Dale Inman and engine builder Maurice Petty knew Richard would need to vacate the car at some point. And there's a great account of this story, and I just want to give a shout out by former racer Rick Crow, who did a podcast with Jimmy Insolo, and you can find it on YouTube. It's a 90-minute discussion with Insolo. It's entertaining and it's insightful, and Jimmy really does a great job talking about some of the other side stories involved with that race at Riverside, where he filled in for the King. He was asked to drive in relief for Petty with 20 laps left in the event. The 43 rejoined the race in 4th place with Insolo now behind the wheel. He passed Cale and finished 3rd. NASCAR, as it always had, awards the points and finishing position to the driver that takes the opening green flag in that car's number. There have been some notable relief drivers taking the checkered first and not officially credited with a victory. NASCAR is not alone. Ray Haroon had a relief driver in the first Indy 500, but few remember his relief driver, Cyrus Paschke. As Mike Hembry, longtime motorsport journalist, pointed out a few years ago, a rearview mirror of that 1979 season would show numerous places in which the tide ebbed and flowed. But Insulo's smooth and steady finish kept Petty in the top 5. With a few minor slip-ups, the King may not have had 7 championships, and Dale Inman may not have claimed 8 career championships as a crew chief. He had 7 with Petty, and 1 came later as crew chief for Terry Labonte in 1984. And that's where my disrupting history reference kind of comes in the most for this presentation. Sometimes it's the smallest mid-season matter of a few laps that can have a great effect on a championship and on legacies. Nearly all Winston West drivers remained regional racing stars, and heading into the 1980s, Westerners continued making their biggest impact on the Cup Series as owners, innovators, crew chiefs, administrators, and mechanics. But just like in baseball's early days, there were stars who never made it east. It wasn't that long ago when the furthest west that Major League Baseball extended was Chicago and St. Louis. In the 1970s, national corporations were mostly disinterested in signing Western talent to their sports marketing platforms. The few mid to large-sized businesses in the Winston West Series were regionally focused companies with a limited national outreach. But it's still hard to not wonder what if from time to time. In 1980, the West Coast lost its rising young star. Tim Williamson died in a crash while qualifying for a Grand American Series event at Riverside a day before his 24th birthday. Williamson had the talent, funding, crew, and support, but we'll never know. Ken Clapp, founder of the West Coast Stock Car Racing Hall of Fame and a longtime NASCAR West Coast executive for decades, mentions in his autobiography that Williamson likely had a cup ride for the 1980 Daytona 500 with car owner J.D. Stacy. And Clapp put it very, very simply. He believed, quote, Williamson could go all the way, unquote. Still, as the Winston West Series enjoyed sustained commitment from NASCAR, it remained a regional minor league series with a driver talent pool capable of making the jump if the major leagues came calling. Finding a job is a job. Therefore, the only route to a cup ride at this time in the sport's history meant a driver was willing to move east and commit to a full-time search. Lacking the necessary resources and commitment needed for this level of outreach, West Coast drivers in their efforts to garner sponsorship and interest from established cup teams remained mostly fruitless throughout the 1970s. Ray Elder, with a family and farm to take care of, could not take that chance. Chuck Bound, who was much younger, did relocate east, and although he enjoyed local and regional success and the 1990 Busch Series championship, the full-time ride remained elusive until the age of 40 in 1994. He linked up with car owner Bobby Allison and Jimmy Fenning as his crew chief. Unfortunately, that season and his career was cut short by a horrible crash. Regionalism persisted in American stock car racing heading into the 1980s, as Southeastern drivers still dominated. Eventually, West Coast drivers found national success as many of the tracks they competed on disappeared, replaced by strip malls, neighborhoods, and rarely with open park space. In the second half of the 1970s, auto racing forever became a much larger component of debates over place and space. Although the Federal Noise Abatement Act of 1972 granted auto racing an exemption from noise statutes and motorsports survived the 73 and 74 OPEC oil embargo, nearly every week from 1975 through 1979, National Speed Sport News and Illustrated Speedway News included at least one article updating the status of a battle between a racetrack operator and his or her neighbors. Forced to address civilian noise complaints, promoters attended workshops to gather tips regarding noise abatement and to develop public-friendly policies. Basically, the survival of a racetrack depended on an owner's willingness to cooperate with citizens and government officials, not drivers and fans. Regardless of a track operator's vain attempt to silence cars and work with surrounding community sprawl and a growing demand for quiet, it still killed countless speedways. However, states and communities enacted their own ordinances, which led to curfews and muffler-equipped race cars. And that's why I'm closing with this photo of Elder in 1978. And he's got, he's got the stash going, which is outstanding. And posing next to his new ride, the Midland ride from '78. And the caption isn't about him winning, going for his 6th championship and having 43 career wins at the time and all of his success on the track. It's about the muffler. And that just kind of shows that racing was be part of a bigger environmental conversation after the OPEC oil embargo. Nearly all of the racetracks where Jack McCoy won 2 Winston West championships and Chuck Bown, Jimmy Inslow, and Herschel McGriff won their series championships are long gone. It was clearly a back in the good old days era for motorsports on the West Coast, but now, looking back 50 years since Ray Elder's 6th and final championship in 1975, we can see that changes were underway, particularly in the business of racing, the politics of racing, and criticism of autosport, with an increasing awareness of the place of motorsports within the environment. The Racing Green initiatives we see today are rooted in the American environmental movement during the 1970s. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dan. Anyone have any questions, comments?